I have been building, painting, collecting, and playing Black Templar for 10 years now, and in all that time you'd have to assume I have the Chapter Master, the High Marshal of the Black Templar. But I never really have. Back in the day, I didn't really want to buy the Helbrecht model because even though he looked pretty darn good from the waist up, he was kind of a tiny little weenie model, and from the waist down, he had a little bit of a little baby boy syndrome. His legs looked like two little toothpicks that could barely hold up the rest of his giant artificer armor. Then when the Space Marines got Primarisified, I once again wanted a Helbrecht model, but I didn't want to use that one, so I found this guy. This model is from Wargames exclusive, and it's a pretty good count as the High Marshal Helbrecht. Painted this up, and this guy has come with me in many games of Warhammer 40,000, but now that there is an official High Marshal Helbrecht model from Games Workshop in Primaris scale that looks lovely, I think it's about time I get the genuine article. I really like this model, and I think Games Workshop likes the Black Templar almost as much as I do, because every Black Templar sculpt for the Space Marines has been really good, has been like several steps above a lot of the other sculpts coming out for Warhammer 40k, and High Marshal Helbrecht is no exception. He is looking lovely, although there's still a few things I kind of want to change about him. Helbrecht isn't a clamshell hero, he gets his own box, and part of the reason for this is the base he stands on. It's a 60mm, one singular Space Marine dude on a gigantic 60mm base. For reference, this was the base old Helbrecht stood on, next to the new one. I guess Helbrecht likes big bases and he cannot lie. Getting him all built, he goes together just about perfect. The only little snag was the cape being in two parts, that leaves a little bit of a seam. His weapons are the Sword of the High Marshal, which has a sweep and strike attack, and of course comes the little servitor Wipey, who eternally wipes the sword clean, and his combi melta servitor. To fix the seam in the cape, I took my Tamiya basic putty and put this over the cracks. Alright, now that I can see my High Marshal Helbrecht on his 60mm base, I can tell why he needed all that extra room. I'm just kidding, it looks ridiculous. He's a normal sized Space Marine. It's not the most egregious offender of oversized bases. That probably goes to the Triumph of St. Catherine. No, actually, it goes to the Tyranid Biovore. Games Workshop did the Tyranid Biovore dirty when they switched it from a 40mm base to an 80mm base. Oh, Games Workshop, why? I really hope they make these decisions from a gameplay aspect and not just a cool aspect, because oversized bases actually make the model much more difficult to play on the tabletop. It's kind of a little bit of a nerf having such a big base, but Helbrecht is pretty darn good, and I have an idea of what to do with all that extra room. On the box art, he's stabbing into an orc, and I'm going to turn that into one of Nick's blue orcs, and one orc is fine, but I want to see if I can add a few more. Helbrecht comes with a sculpted base, which actually is pretty close to my Templar basing scheme. Luckily, the base is in two chunks, one chunk with the orc and one chunk without. I glued down the orc chunk, making sure that there was room for him, and then lost the second half. Then I took some of my new monopose orc boys who are running. These should work well as recently dead orcs. I cut off one arm and removed some of the decorations, and to build up some height, I used tinfoil, squishing it down onto the base with super glue and then squishing my orc into it to make sure that there was room. I had to grind down the front of my orc to flatten him out, and then I put milliput to blend my new stuff into the Games Workshop sculpted base. And as if 2 orcs weren't enough, 3 is a party. I cut one guy in half and made him sticking out of the side of the base. I filled in more of the base with milliput and squished the third friend into position. I went to my old orc sprue to find an arm, and I put this draped over the arm of the original dead orc. And I cut the foot of the running pose orc to make it look like he was properly comatose. Now that I'm happy with my casualties, I sprinkled on some sand using ultra thin super glue to lock it into position. I would use wood glue, but it would be impossible to keep from brushing the glue onto the orcs. The ultra thin super glue spreads out, finding the sand grains for me. Once I had the sand all around the orcs, I did some fine tuning using leftover milliput to resculpt and fix some of the gaps in my orcs, and I did use some wood glue to fill in the larger sections that are easy to reach with a brush. And there is a base that is fit for my High Marshal and to make Nick sad. I got Helbrecht ready for painting in Subassemblies. To properly stick him down to my paint handles, I put a piece of cork onto the double stick tape and then made another smaller piece of tape on top so that he's standing straight with his leg lifted pose. Then for his backpack decorations. I like it, but I want to go further. My Templar like to wear candles, so I broke out the Epic Basing Bits candles. I sanded the candles on an angle so they'll fit on the front of his backpack. Then I put some milliput all around his neck and power plant. I put super glue on the candles and then pressed these into the wet milliput like they've been dripping behind him for hours. A little poking and prodding got these into position, and old Brekkie is ready for painting. I really like how this base turned out. It's fun to see a bunch of casualties, and they do a good job of helping to sell why he's on such a humongous base. Have I complained enough about how big this base is? Just a whole bunch of dead Nick Blue orcs. Oh, I should have used his models. I used my own, but that's okay, I'll get him back when I wipe out his boy squad in game. And speaking of Orc Boys, it is very conceivable that the High Marshal could take out a 10-man Orc squad every single turn. He does about 3 mortal wounds on the charge in, and then he has a sweep attack of 12 attacks hitting on 2s, strength 6, AP minus 3, damage 1. That'll pretty likely take out a 10-man Orc Boy squad. He might be able to chew through a 20-man squad if he's backed up by some Primaris Sword Brethren, which you don't take the High Marshal all by himself. Really excited to get this guy in games, and I'm really excited to display him with the rest of my army. Maybe in a lovely Cobalt Keep display case. Not only does Cobalt Keep make the highest quality magnetic wargaming bases around, but their display cases are the sharpest way to protect, display, and transport your collections in style. Their hero display case can hold 1 epic miniature, with a built-in metal plate in the bottom so you don't have to worry about magnet polarity. Your model will be held firmly while keeping your Cheeto fingers off, and these cases are stackable so you can show off your collection in style. The floor of these cases is made of a large metal sheet so your models will be held securely no matter where you put them in the case. From experience, I can say rocking up to the local game store with your models in one of these bad boys will get you some attention. It's a really slick case and the best way to show off, store, and transport your prized minis. The high quality, crystal clear polycarbonate shell securely clips into place, keeping your minis safe. And if you have a model that's too big for the army case, Cobalt Keep's got you covered with their cavalry cases. These are big enough to hold actual monsters or any other big impressive centerpiece model in your collection. If you want to pick up some magnetic display cases and show off your minis in style, you can shop with the code EOB10 to get 10% off your order of Cobalt Keep cases. A big thanks to Cobalt Keep for sponsoring this video. My Helbrecht will look dapper in a cavalry case alongside his battle brothers. I primed my Marshal in black, which you would think is the color of the Black Templars High Marshal, but in fact, he is a goldish light color. I zenithalled him with white paint from above, a good step for any model, and for his armor, I don't know exactly what color I want it to be. Something different, something gold, but a gold that works with the rest of them. I went to my Sarah Clark cubes and found a palette that might work. It's olive and cream with some blues and a dark green. I replicated these colors on my wet palette and gave it a try. I put the olive down in the model, this is my mid-tone, and I base coated all the armor in it. Then I used my dry brush to brush on the cream. This will quickly and messily block in my highlights and shadows. Then for the recesses, I watered down the dark green. If this color wasn't named dark green, I wouldn't have known it's not black, but it looks pretty good in the darker parts of his olive gold armor, which also has plenty of green in it. I went back and forth using my olive and cream to get my blend smooth using lots and lots of layers. I want to try my best on Helbrecht, and that means a lot of layers. I used the cream for my highlights, and in just a few places I used white paint to push these highlights further. His armor is now done, and I dig it. It's very unique. I was using the Sarah Clark color cards, and when I bought these, I was a little bit disappointed. I was, just colors, and I thought, is this gonna be better than like Pinterest or Google to get color ideas? But forcing myself to use these colors because I liked the picture, it made for some really unique armor that I wouldn't have come up with all by myself. And Helbrecht wears very unique armor. It's kind of a goldy, coppery, brassy, bronzy, different in every single artistic depiction of him. I feel like this matches a picture of Helbrecht I really like from Games Workshop, where he's almost like a yellow color. I really dig it, and I'm excited to see if stone blue and teal will look good on his cloak. I wrapped his pointy back banner in some silly putty to keep my disgusting Cheeto fingers from scuffing the paint, and then I thinned down my teal to an almost black and base coated all of his cloth. Then I highlighted it with my stone blue, also darkened, doing a few layers until he was mostly saturated paint. I left the highlights really dark. His cloak is supposed to be black, but it can't just be black or else it'll look like I didn't try. I'm liking how the tealy black is looking next to his green-yellow armor. It does look like the picture. But now I have to leave the Sarah Cube swatches behind to do some more colors. All the insides of his cape are red, and I base coated these with a dark red, doing many glazes up to pure Evil Sun Scarlet, my favorite red paint. Now for his little lantern. I airbrush a spot of white where it's shining red on his cape, using a playing card to mask off where the top of the lantern would be cutting off the light. Then I put Fugen orange over the lamp and over the white spotlight. I glued the lamp into position permanently before finishing off the frame of the lamp with some yellow paint and what was left of my olive and tan. I didn't want to paint the backside, so that's why I glued it first, and then used some more Fugen orange on the leg to help the lantern glow. Next, I took off the silly putty to get at those candles. I don't want them to be too bright, I don't want them to pull any focus away from his face, so I made these candles a gradient of gray, using my stone gray as a base. I dry brushed the tops of the candles with the white paint to highlight all those little drippies, and then made the flames glow from an orange to yellow. Then I picked out his skull with some Agrax Earthshade. Now for his face. I base coated it with a dark red beige and gave it a wash with some Reikland Flesh Shade. I think Games Workshop actually sculpts their head specifically with this paint in mind. It always seems to work out. Then I highlighted it with a tan mix with my original red beige, focusing on his dome, cheeks, and his chin. Helbrecht has one of the biggest chins in the biz. I carefully picked out his eyes. I had to do this a few times, and it almost doesn't matter. His crown is so big it's hard to see his eyes. And for that crown, I used the same gold recipe as on his armor. I plopped his head into his head hole with some plastic glue. I like to use plastic glue for heads because super glue sets instantly and I want a little wiggle room. Too many of my Space Marines are looking in slightly the wrong direction because of super glue. I got Helbrecht nearly finished, but because Games Workshop wanted to justify a 60mm base, it comes with 2 more guys, his little toadies, the Servitors, one of which carries his Combi Melta Ferocity, which in 10th edition is not particularly ferocious. It's fine. One of my least favorite things of 10th edition is what they did to combi weapons. Instead of being 1 shot of Flamer, or 1 shot of Plasma, or 1 shot of Melta, it's just 2 shots, anti-infantry 4-up, which is arguably better against the types of opponents he's gonna be fighting, but I would have really preferred a Melta profile because it would have been really funny to absolutely disintegrate one Orc Boy a turn. And of course, there's also his often memed on Servitor with a hanky. Just follows him around and gives his sword a little polish. I want these guys to match Helbrecht, not his gilded armor, but his vibe, and for that I went back to my teal and stone gray. Stone gray on their shirts and teal on their pants, giving each of these a little highlight. Then I watered down some Black Templar contrast paint, which it's amazing I've made it this far into painting a Black Templar before using this color, and put this all over their metal bits. I highlighted these with my stone gray mixed with white paint, and the metal was done. Time for the flesh. I painted up their skin the same way I did Helbrecht, using a little bit of red paint mixed in with some red beige so they were more color saturated, then highlighted up to a pure white. For their chains, I painted these to match Helbrecht's armor. These are very important servitors, although Helbrecht probably has an army of his own servitors to carry out every task that is beneath him. Then for his Combi Melta, I painted the upper section with a gradient of orange to yellow. This is something I've taken to doing on many of my Black Templar to give them a more John Blanche feel. With Helbrecht's 2 little friends done, it is time for his sword arm. To protect the painting I've already done, and to make this little thing easier to hold onto, I pressed it into a big piece of Silly Putty. Then I painted his shoulder pad, base coating it in white and then making a gradient from white to tan and then to just a little bit of brown. My Templars have been crusading against Nyx Blue Orcs for over 200 years, so the white details have started to tarnish. Then I painted his Black Templar cross the opposite of his left shoulder pad, black with red instead of red with black. I put the last of my teal paint onto the handle of his sword and I decided to make some more of this color for the blade. I base coated it in dark teal and then painted on some layers of lighter and lighter teal so that there was a glowing gradient in the middle of the sword. I edge highlighted it and then went back and forth glazing on my mid-tone teal and light teal until the gradient was smooth. I fixed any mistakes I made with dark teal and then used white paint for the glowiest glowy spots on his sword. Then I got out my sharpest paintbrush and carefully painted a lightning bolt running up the middle of his sword, giving my brush a very slight wiggle as I dragged it along, and boom, the sword of the High Marshal is done. Now that Brecci is done, it is time to paint that base, and some Nyx Orcs. I've actually painted a Nyx Orc before. They're a lot of fun. Almost as much fun as our Patreon. Ever wanted to fight your battles in the labyrinthine hallways of a starship? Moving your models in tight formation through a maze of corridors, bulkheads, and junctions where retreat is impossible and danger is around every corner? Well, the EonsOfBattle Starship Interior is here to make that dream a reality. For the month of July, subscribers to our Patreon will receive the Starship Interior, a set of claustrophobic, dynamic, and modular hallways that are scaled to perfectly suit wargaming miniatures and give you a new way to play. To start out, I painted all the sand using my classic Templar recipe, super watered down Vallejo earth, and then I dry brushed it with Pro Acryl Olive Flesh. For the pants of the Orcs, I used Games Workshop Skeleton Horde contrast paint, and then painted on some Buccaneer stripes, vertical red lines running down the pant legs, starting with a dark red and then doing a few highlights of brighter reds. I put more Skeleton Horde over the shirts, and then for all the straps I used Black Templar, highlighting these up with my Stonewall Gray. To make black things look black, it's important not to go too hard on the highlights. You want small highlights that get brighter quickly. Then for the famous blue skin of Nyx Orcs, I started with Army Painter Beowulf Blue, and then base coating each round muscle section with Ultramarines Blue, finishing it off with some highlights of Magic Blue mixed with white, doing a gradient until the skin was poppin'. I picked out the teeth with white paint and the eyes with red. And for all the weapons and armor, Nyx goes with an orange. I base coated these with a nice pumpkin orange and then washed them with a watered down Rattling Grime, a brown-black contrast paint. Then for the chipping, usually I would do a metallic silver, but I'm doing non-metallic metal for Helbrecht, so I did chips of gray and light gray paint, sponging this on. As a last little bit of fun, I sprinkled on a little blood for the blood god. Not too much, I don't want the base to look too busy, just a little, like salting to taste. And then the base is done, it's finally time to assemble the centerpiece of my Templar collection. I glued Helbrecht onto the Orcs, and the new Orcs put him at a slightly different angle than the Games Workshop sculpt, so I had to lengthen his shoulder with just a little bit of milliput. I glued on a tiny ball and painted this with dark green to match the rest of his armor. Now for the servitors. White B was real easy, gluing him down right by the sword, but for the multi-melta guy, I glued him down in front instead of behind Helbrecht. A little extra blood for the blood god on the sword and the base rim in black, and this model is ready for the gaming table. I would have loved this model 10 years ago when I started my Black Templar army, but it has taken me 10 years to be able to paint him like this. High Marshal Helbrecht is done. Recently, I've been painting tons and tons of units for Warhammer, and so it was really nice to pour a lot of time into one singular model and really try my hardest on it. And now that I've done it, I want to go back to painting squads. Helbrecht is essentially the Primarch of the Black Templar. Well, technically Sigismund is the Primarch of the Black Templar, or rather he was. He was killed by Abaddon the Despoiler. One of the few things that Abaddon has actually done. I guess his 13th Black Crusade worked out, but now Helbrecht stands in the Primarch slot, and he is one of the most powerful Space Marines in the galaxy, leading essentially a legion across the stars. And now he can lead my Space Marines across the table on his gigantic 60mm base. But you know what? I bet if Sigismund ever returned to the 40k universe, he would be standing on an even bigger base. A big thanks to Cobalt Keep for sponsoring this video and helping me to get Helbrecht all painted up. In 40 minutes or so, I'm gonna go play a game of 40k. And maybe Helbrecht is gonna come with.